When the television crews showed up in Cuero in August of 2007, I was out at my north stock tank checking the float valve on the windmill. Same thing I did every Wednesday morning. The same rotation my father ran before me and his father before him on this same stretch of DeWitt County, Caliche. My cell phone rang and it was Earl Messer calling from his truck somewhere on the county road. And Earl said, "There's news crews over in Cuero." And I said, "What for?" And he said they found a dead animal at that woman's place on the edge of town, and the news is calling it a Chupacabra. I asked what the animal looked like. He said hairless, probably a coyote with mange, and they were doing DNA testing. I said, "Yeah." Earl said, "What do you think?" I said, "I think it's a mangy coyote." We both went quiet for a few seconds on the phone, which Earl and I almost never did, because neither one of us was built for telephone silence. We both knew what I meant by that. I meant, that dead animal in the freezer is a coyote with mange, and what we had been dealing with on our properties for the previous 2.5 years was not a coyote with mange, and was not any coyote at all. A coyote with mange kills with its mouth. Canine teeth tearing into flesh leave a specific wound pattern that any livestock operator in South Texas can read after their first year. The tearing, the crushing, the blood distributed across the kill site, the drag marks, the tracks in the caliche, the torn fleece or hide where the animal fought back. A coyote makes a scene. What we had been dealing with did not make a scene. It left 2 small round holes at the throat and left the animal beside those holes drained completely of every drop of blood it had carried. The body lighter than it should have been by the exact impossible weight of all that blood, and the ground underneath bone dry. What killed our animals did its work without leaving evidence that the work had been done. That is not a coyote. That is not any predator I have dealt with in 35 years of raising livestock in DeWitt County. The word Chupacabra got attached to that coyote in Cuero and got repeated everywhere through the fall of 2007 and beyond, and it became the story people told about DeWitt County and the one you find if you search the county now. That story is not the one I am here to tell. I am going to tell you what I documented across my property and the adjacent properties for 2.5 years before those cameras ever drove into Cuero, and I'm going to tell you what I watched from the northeast corner of my east pasture on a Wednesday night in August of 2005, and I am going to tell you why the mangy coyote story could not account for any part of it. If you're new to this channel, I'd ask you to subscribe before we go further and hit the notification bell. These accounts take a long time to gather and put together accurately, and every subscriber keeps this work going. If you're already subscribed, I appreciate you being here. Now let me tell you what happened in DeWitt County. My name is Hank Rudd. I've been ranching in DeWitt County, Texas since I came back from Texas A&M in the fall of 1983 with a degree in agricultural science and enough debt to keep me honest. I run a cow-calf operation and a herd of boer does on 1,840 acres in the northeastern part of the county, off a caliche road that branches from Texas Highway 72, about 9 miles north of Cuero, and heads east toward the Gonzales County line. My grandfather, Ira Rudd, filed on the first 800 acres of this ground in 1922 and started breaking coastal Bermuda and planting coastal plain grasses in the years when this whole part of South Texas was still figuring out what it was going to be. My father added the east pasture in 1961 when the Hendricks family sold. I've been adding back where I could since the 80s. DeWitt County in its northeastern section has a specific character that takes a few seasons to understand. The terrain runs from flat, open coastal plain near the Guadalupe River to rolling country with heavier cedar and live oak cover as you move east toward Gonzales County, and the soil shifts from sandy loam to the heavy black clay of the low drainage areas along Sandy Creek that crack in drought along the same seams every year and swell tight in wet years until the ground looks and sounds like something, adjusting to pressure. The county gets around 31 inches of rain in a good year, but the distribution is wrong for easy agriculture. Too much in spring and too little through the dry months from June into September that can run 8 or 9 weeks without meaningful precipitation. In those stretches, the coastal Bermuda goes dormant and the stock tanks drop, and the caliche turns to flour dust that rises behind every truck on the county roads and settles on the mesquite leaves and doesn't wash off until the next real rain. The northeast corner of my east pasture, where most of what I am going to describe took place, is a specific piece of ground. The pasture itself is open coastal Bermuda and native grass for most of its 600 acres, with the 2 stock tanks and the live oak motte along Sandy Creek at the south end. But at the northeast corner, the brushy cedar and huzosh strip that runs inside the fence line is heaviest, maybe 30 meters wide at the widest point before it opens back to pasture. Sandy Creek begins its drainage down through there, and the soil in that corner is the heaviest black clay on the property, the kind that holds moisture longer than the surrounding ground and grows native forbs and browse species that the does preferred in the cooler months. It was the most sheltered corner of the pasture and the furthest from the barn and the house, a corner of the property where you could move through the brushy strip without being visible from the road or the buildings. I thought about that geography many times after April of 2005. The house my grandfather built is still the main house, added onto 3 times since 1924, but with the original concrete block walls still visible in the hallway and the back bedroom. The equipment shed is new, 1997, replaced the old one after the hailstorm that year. The goat pens are behind the shed, cedar post construction with welded wire, and the east pasture, where most of what I'm going to describe took place, runs from the back fence of the home area all the way to the east property line. About 600 acres of mixed coastal Bermuda and native grass with 2 stock tanks and a strip of live oak motte along Sandy Creek at the south end. I want to establish something before I go into the specifics, and that is who I am and how I know what I know. I am not someone who interprets things dramatically. I have been in the livestock business my entire adult life, and I have a practical relationship with what kills animals and what doesn't. I know what coyote damage looks like, what feral hog damage looks like, what disease losses look like, what a doe with kidding complications looks like, what a steer that went down in the heat looks like. I have a filing cabinet in my office with 35 years of production records going back to my father's time, and in 2005 I started keeping a second binder in that cabinet that I did not expect to keep and that I have kept current ever since, and that binder is the primary source for everything I'm about to tell you. The people I'll mention by name have agreed to be identified or are no longer living. A few neighbors whose accounts I'll include ask that I use different names, and I have done that. The facts of what those people experienced have not been changed. What I'm about to describe started in April of 2005 and continued into the fall of that year, with reduced incidents through 2006 and sporadic documented losses after that. Before April of 2005, I had never experienced livestock losses that I could not explain. After April of 2005, I have had entries in that second binder every year through 2016, the most recent dated October the 8th of that year. Let me tell you about the morning I found doe number 47, April the 9th, 2005, a Monday early morning, 6 o'clock. I was doing my kidding season rounds through the east pasture, which I ran every morning from late March through May when my Boer does were dropping. Boer goats are a South African meat breed, stocky and adaptable, and a well-managed herd in South Texas coastal country can kid twice a year if you run it right. I was carrying 198 does through that spring kidding, and checking them in the morning before the heat came was part of the daily structure. Doe number 47 was a 3-year-old. Third kidding season, good condition, no problems noted in any prior check. I found her in the northeast corner of the east pasture, lying on her side with her legs extended straight behind her. My first thought was that she'd had trouble overnight, dystocia or a prolapse, the kind of thing you find at the tail end of a kidding season when you're near the last does to drop. I looked for a kid nearby. There was no kid. There was no blood. The ground beneath her was dry. I knelt down and put my hand on her flank. A healthy, mature Bordeaux runs between 60 and 80 kilograms, and dead or alive, she still has dimension, the weight of organ mass and fluid and tissue. What my hand found was wrong before my brain had named it. She weighed maybe half what she should have. Her hide was smooth and intact, the hair normal, the feet clean. When I pressed gently on her side, the rib cage gave way under my hand and came back slowly when I released, the way a bag gives when there's less inside it than there should be. The inside of this animal did not have the structure that the inside of an animal that has recently died should have. I rolled her onto her back. In the bare skin of the jugular groove below the right ear, I found 2 holes. Round, clean-edged, about 5 millimeters across each, placed about 2 centimeters apart, the skin at the margins puckered inward slightly, pulling toward the openings. No blood dried around them, no bleeding that had dried in the hair, no bruising or discoloration in the surrounding skin. 2 holes in the most accessible vascular point on a goat's neck, and the ground beneath her completely dry. A mature boar doe of her size carries between 3.5 and 4 liters of blood. That is not a small amount. That volume of blood cannot exit 2 5-millimeter openings and go nowhere. It goes somewhere. It obeys gravity. I have slaughtered livestock. I have seen what blood does when it leaves a body, and you are not trying to contain it. It spreads. It darkens the soil. It stains whatever it touches. The ground beneath doe number 47 showed none of that. I stood up and took a few steps back from the carcass. I do not know how long I stood there. Probably not long. But the quality of that morning is something I have returned to many times, and it stays specific in my memory in a way that most mornings do not. The east pasture in April before the heat builds has a particular light, the sun not yet fully up, the sky a flat gray pink at the horizon line, the coastal Bermuda holding the night dew in beads on each blade that catch whatever light is available and throw it back in small glints. My shadow ran long and thin to the west. The other does in the pasture were foraging and moving the way a healthy herd moves in the early morning, loose clusters drifting across the grass, the normal low conversational sound of a herd doing what herds do. 197 animals in the same 600 acres, all night, and when I had left them at 5:30 the evening before, they were fine. Doe number 47 had been alive at that check. What unsettled me more than the body itself was the herd. When a coyote comes into a goat pasture at night, the herd responds. They alarm, they cluster, they move, they make noise that carries a quarter mile on a still South Texas night. What I was looking at was the evidence of something that had come and taken from this pasture overnight without triggering a single observable response from 197 animals that had been within a few hundred meters of it. Whatever had been here had not disturbed them, had passed through their night without registering as a threat. I had 32 years of experience with what spooked livestock in this county, and I did not have a framework for that. I went back to the barn and called Dr. Jackie Mares. Jackie had been my large animal vet since 2001, when old Dr. Pemberton retired after 40 years of covering DeWitt County and the surrounding area. Jackie grew up in Cuero, went to the veterinary school at Texas A&M, came back to open her own practice on the western side of the county. She was thorough and direct, and had the particular honesty of someone who would rather tell you she didn't know than make something up. She answered my call and said she'd come out that afternoon. She drove out after lunch in her white truck, and I walked her to the northeast corner of the east pasture. She knelt beside the carcass and worked through her examination in a systematic way, the same order every time, the same documentation. She tested for rigor, which was consistent with death 6 to 8 hours prior. She pressed the abdomen and watched her own hands for a moment. She checked body temperature with her rectal thermometer and looked at the reading and checked it again. She said the core temperature was anomalous. Standard algor mortis, the post-mortem cooling of a body toward ambient temperature, proceeds at roughly 1 to 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit per hour. The overnight low had been 53 degrees. For an animal dead 6 hours, the core temperature should have been within a few degrees of ambient. The reading she was holding was 11 degrees Fahrenheit above the ambient ground temperature. She wrote it in her notes and did not offer an explanation for it. She examined the wound site with the loop she kept on her instrument roll. She measured the diameter of each opening, the spacing between them, the angle of penetration relative to the neck surface. She pressed the surrounding tissue for fluid and found none. She said the placement was consistent with simultaneous access to the external jugular vein and the carotid artery from a single entry point on the right side. She said that combination of vessels, at that angle, achieves complete and rapid exsanguination with minimal external evidence of blood loss in a surgical context. She stopped and looked at me. I said, "In a surgical context." She said, "In a clinical setting, with instruments and a controlled approach." She said she was not aware of any predator capable of replicating that placement with that precision. She said she was going to write her assessment as cause of death undetermined and submit it to TAHC as required and recommend a follow-up if further losses occurred. She packed her kit and I walked her back to her truck, and we stood in the ranch yard for a minute, in the particular way you stand when a professional conversation has not reached a conclusion and both people know it. She said she would look through her reference material for any comparable wound presentation. I said I would appreciate it. She said to call her immediately if it happened again, and something in the way she said immediately told me the emphasis was not routine. She drove out the Caliche Road toward the highway, and I watched the dust her tires raised hang in the still late afternoon air before it settled back onto the Caliche. I went inside and made a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. I had been sitting at this table with a problem I could not solve since 5:30 in the morning, and the problem had not gotten any smaller with the vet's visit. What it had gotten was more precisely defined, which in some ways made it worse. The wound placement was consistent with surgical-level access to both the jugular and the carotid at once, from a single entry point. Complete exsanguination, with no blood at the scene. Core temperature 11 degrees above ambient in an animal dead at least 6 hours. If I had walked her through those findings as a hypothetical and asked her to name the predator, she would not have been able to name one. I knew that before she arrived. Having a trained veterinarian confirm that the evidence was beyond her experience was clarifying in the way that a door closing is clarifying. It tells you which direction is blocked. I got a yellow legal pad from the desk in my office, and I sat back down at the kitchen table and I wrote it out. 4 pages, starting with the date and the ambient temperature at 6 that morning and working through every observation in order: the posture of the body, the weight when I lifted her, the ground conditions, the 2 wounds, the measurements I had taken, what Dr. Mares had found, and what she had said and what she had not said. I wrote it the way I would write a field observation for the Extension Service, factual and sequenced, without interpretation. When I was done, I labeled the top of the first page April 9, 2005, and I put it in the filing cabinet next to my production records and went to bed. That was the beginning of my binder. I called her 11 days later when I found 2 more does in the same corner of the same pasture. She came back out. The 2 animals showed the same wound profile, the same complete absence of blood, the same anomalous warmth in the chest cavity. She had brought necropsy equipment this time, and she opened both carcasses and documented what was inside. The organ tissue was intact and correctly positioned. The cardiovascular system was collapsed. She collected samples from the wound margins and sent them to the lab in Victoria. The Victoria lab results came back in 2 weeks. She called me and read me the summary. The results showed what she described as unusual cellular morphology at the wound margins, tissue that had been subjected to a sustained drawing pressure rather than a cutting or puncturing force. The laboratory did not have comparative samples for this kind of wound presentation and could not characterize it further. Her report to the Texas Animal Health Commission listed cause of death as undetermined. Ta sent a form. I filled it out. Nothing further came of it. In May of 2005, I called my neighbor Earl Messer. Earl ran 1,400 acres to my west, a mixed operation with cattle and 130 commercial ewes he'd added a few years earlier. We'd known each other our entire lives, the way you know someone when your grandfather's fence line was your earliest memory of a property boundary. He was 60 then, steady and unimpressed with things that tried to impress him, the kind of man you go to when you want to know whether you're reading a situation correctly, because he'd tell you honestly if you weren't. He had a master's degree in range science from Texas Tech that he never mentioned unless someone asked about it, which was typical of him. He was more interested in what the land was doing than in credentials about land, and his 40-plus years of working the same 1,400 acres gave him a comparative baseline that no classroom had ever matched. Earl's south pasture ran along my west fence line and shared, at its far corner, a small triangular section of drainage that connected to my Sandy Creek bottom. The terrain in that corner was brush-heavy, low-lying black clay soil that held water after rain and dried to concrete in drought, and it was where his and my properties were closest together. If something was moving through the county in a circuit, the geography of that shared drainage made it a natural passage point between our operations. I thought about that often after I understood what I was dealing with. I asked if he'd had any livestock losses he couldn't explain. He went quiet for a moment, which was unusual for Earl. Then he said he'd been losing ewes since March, and he hadn't found an explanation he was satisfied with. I said I thought I might know what he was seeing, and he said, "How do you know what I'm seeing when I haven't told you?" And I said, "I think I know the wounds." He said, "Come over in the morning." I drove over and he took me to the south pasture, where his most recent ewe had gone down 4 days earlier. The body had been worked by heat and birds enough that the wound site wasn't visible, but he showed me the photographs he'd taken when he found her. On his phone screen, in the early morning light, 2 holes, the same diameter, the same placement in the jugular groove, the same clean margins. The grass below the carcass was dry. We stood at the fence line, looking south toward his creek bottom, the live oaks dark along the water in the distance. He said he'd called TAHC when he lost the first ewe. They sent a form. I said I'd called too. He said his vet had said predation, possibly raccoon or coyote, which he'd found unsatisfying because neither of those animals produced that wound profile on his livestock in 30 years of losing animals to both of them. I said there was someone else he should talk to. I'd been at church the previous Sunday and mentioned my losses to Terrell Hicks over coffee in the fellowship hall, and Terrell had responded in a specific way, the kind of careful quietness that meant a man had something he was deciding whether to say. Terrell Hicks ran about 1,000 acres southeast of my place, a family property going back to the 1940s on his father's side. He was 58 in 2005, a Vietnam veteran who had come home in 1971 and walked straight into the cattle business and never looked back. He was lean and deliberate, with a voice that sounded like it came up through gravel, and he had the quality of observation that comes from years of doing the same careful work across the same ground. He described what he saw the way you'd read a field report, specific, sequenced, without drama. I drove out to see him and we sat on his back porch and I asked what he'd been dealing with. He told me he'd found his first dead steer in February of 2005, 8 weeks before my first loss, a 3-year-old in the south pasture. He'd found it at 8 in the morning, rigor consistent with death overnight, and when he'd knelt and put his hand on the steer's side, what he felt was a warmth coming from the chest cavity that should not have been there. He repeated the specific numbers: overnight low of 41 degrees, animal dead at least 6 hours, chest cavity warm to the touch from the inside when he pressed through the collapsed hide. He had felt a lot of dead cattle in his life, and none of them had felt like that. He had a green composition book on the table between us, and he slid it across without my asking. It had entries starting from February the 14th of 2005. 6 animals through June, 3 steers, 2 first calf heifers, 1 bull calf. Each entry gave a date, a GPS coordinate from his handheld unit, a description of the wound site, the ambient temperature at the time of finding, and his assessment of body temperature based on touch. 3 of the 6 he'd noted what he called elevated internal warmth. 2 entries had a line about smell, chemical, sulfurous, like struck matches with something antiseptic underneath it. I had not told Terrell anything about a smell. His composition book had been running for 3 months before I'd lost my first animal. He had written it down independently, in his own words, from his own experience. Sulfur. Something antiseptic underneath. He had also seen something. He told me this last, and he told it carefully. One specific night in July of 2004, more than a year before our conversation, when he had been driving back from the south end of his property on County Road 118 at 3 in the morning after sitting with a cow that was calving. He came around a curve in the road and his headlights hit something crossing about 40 meters ahead. He said it was upright, bipedal, taller than he expected from that distance, and he'd slowed to a stop instinctively. The headlights caught it for maybe 4 or 5 seconds as it crossed from the bar ditch on the left to the cedar break on the right. He said the skin was gray-green in the headlights, not the tawny or brown or dark of any animal he knew. The head was wrong in proportion, too large at the top with a narrowing jaw, the skull sitting forward on the neck. The eyes, when it turned its head toward the truck, did not reflect the headlights. He'd shone his headlights at thousands of animals on this county road over the years. Every one of them had thrown some light back, the tapetal reflection that makes a deer or a coyote or a cat glow from the roadside at night. This one's eyes absorbed the beam and gave nothing back. He paused in the telling and looked at the composition book rather than at me. He told me that while it was in his headlights, while he was watching it cross, he'd thought about the 30-06 in the rack behind the seat. The thought was clear and available, not vague. He'd thought, "The rifle is behind you," but his hands on the steering wheel did not move. The connection between the thought and the action was interrupted in a way he had never experienced before. He sat with his hands on the wheel, the rifle 2 feet behind him, and watched the thing cross into the cedar and disappear. And by the time whatever had broken that connection released, the brush had closed behind it and there was nothing to see. He had written that night in his composition book too. The entry was 7 lines. He read it to me. County Road 118, approximately 3 to 10 a.m., July 23rd, 2004. Bipedal, approximately 5 feet tall, gray-green skin color and headlights, eyes non-reflective, hands would not operate, duration in headlights, 4 to 5 seconds, crossed into cedar break, south side. He closed the composition book and set it on the table between us. We sat on his back porch for a while without talking. The cattle in his south pen were moving in the morning heat, the sound of them shifting at the water trough, and his windmill to the east was turning slowly in a low breeze. A mockingbird was working the cedar thicket along the east fence, running through its inventory. Normal morning sounds on a working ranch. Terrell had been carrying those 7 lines for more than a year before I drove out to see him. 14 months of driving past County Road 118, adding entries to his composition book about dead cattle with wounds he could not explain, watching his neighbors and the county extension office and the TAHC absorb his reports without any result. He had considered calling the sheriff's department and decided the call would accomplish nothing. He had thought about contacting Texas Parks and Wildlife, who had a regional office in Victoria, and had not been able to construct a description of what he needed to report that would be received as a serious inquiry. The official channels for unexplained livestock losses existed and were inadequate. The official channel for what he had seen on County Road 118 did not exist. A man who has served in combat has a particular relationship with things that cannot be officially acknowledged. Terrell had come back from Vietnam in 1971 with a set of experiences that the official accounts of that war did not contain, and he had spent 50-plus years since then functioning normally in a county where people knew him as a steady and reliable rancher, and not as someone carrying anything unusual. He knew how to maintain that separation. He had been doing it since before I was grown. What I understood, sitting on his porch with his composition book on the table between us, was that he had been waiting for someone to come to him with enough of the same evidence that the conversation would not cost him anything. He was not going to initiate it. But when I asked the right question in the right way, everything came out organized and documented and ready, because he had been maintaining it that way for 14 months against the possibility that this conversation might eventually happen. Earl and I put our records next to Terrell's composition book on Terrell's kitchen table, and we spent an afternoon going through them. 25 documented animal deaths across 3 properties from February through the end of May of 2005. 6 Brangus and crossbred cattle of Terrell's, 14 Bordeaux's, and 1 buck of mine. 5 Rambouillet ewes of Earl's, all with bilateral throat punctures, all completely drained, all with dry ground underneath them, all in a rough oval pattern on a county map that swung from Terrell's southeast corner through my northeast pasture and into Earl's south pasture, like something moving through the county in a circuit and taking from each place in turn. We spread Terrell's County Road Atlas on the table, and I penciled in each incident location from the GPS coordinates in all 3 of our records. The oval was clearer on paper than I had expected. Terrell's losses started at the southeast corner of his place and tracked northwest toward my fence line. My losses started at my northeast corner and moved toward the southwest, toward the shared drainage between my property and Earl's. Earl's losses were concentrated in the south pasture nearest the drainage. If you ran a line through the incident points in chronological order, it described a rough counterclockwise circuit, hitting each property in sequence and returning, the interval between incidents on any single property consistent enough to suggest a schedule. None of us said what we were all thinking, which was that we were looking at a routing pattern. Animals that route themselves have territories. Animals that hunt territories and return on schedules are doing something purposeful and learned, not random. Whatever had been working through our properties since February had been here before and knew where to come back. Terrell said he thought the pattern probably extended beyond the three of us. He'd heard from a cousin who ran goats in Gonzales County, just across our East County line, who had a similar unexplained loss in January of 2005 before Terrell's February entry, which would put a starting point even further east and southeast than our current records showed. He hadn't confirmed it because he hadn't known what to ask until today. I wrote Gonzales County in January 2005 at the top of the county road atlas page and underlined it. Terrell, let me copy the composition book on his home printer. I put the pages in my binder alongside my own records and the photographs I'd been keeping. In June of 2005, I called the DeWitt County office of Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. The county agent I reached put me in touch with a specialist named Faye Delton who covered livestock and range issues for the district. I knew Faye by reputation as a serious and methodical person who'd been doing this work for close to 2 decades in South Texas and who had a way of looking at problems from the evidence in rather than from her preferred conclusion. Out. She drove out on a Tuesday, and I walked her out to the northeast corner of the east pasture and showed her my binder and walked her through the pattern. She spent 30 minutes at the northeast corner, and she noticed on her own, without my pointing it out, that the grass in a rough circle about 10 meters across was shorter and yellower than the surrounding pasture. I had been watching that circle since April and hadn't known how to explain it. She knelt and pulled up several plugs from inside and outside the circle and compared them. She said the growth inside the circle showed signs of chemical suppression, not drought stress, not herbicide patterning, but a general inhibition that was consistent in coverage and that had not spread to the surrounding grass. She asked if I'd had any spills or chemical applications in that area. I had not. She said she'd send a soil sample to the lab at College Station, and she did. The results came back 3 weeks later showing elevated sulfur compound concentrations in the soil within the circle, approximately 4 times what the surrounding pasture soil showed. She called me when she got the results and read them to me and said she did not have a source to attribute them to. No petroleum infrastructure near that part of the property. No natural gas venting that she or anyone at the extension office was aware of. She said that elevated soil sulfur at those concentrations in an isolated area could theoretically indicate repeated organic deposition from an unknown source, but she was not able to characterize what source would produce that pattern. She also told me something I have kept in my binder and that I have thought about many times since. She told me that in 18 years of livestock extension work in South Texas, she had never encountered an exsanguination event with the wound profile I had shown her, and she had no framework to explain it. She filed her own assessment with the Extension Service. She transferred to the McLennan County office in 2007, and I have not spoken to her since. I called the DeWitt County Sheriff's Office in late June of 2005, not because I thought it was a law enforcement matter, but because I wanted to know if any other ranchers in the county had reported similar losses. The dispatcher I reached was polite and unhelpful. She said she could check for any open livestock loss reports and came back after a few minutes with the information that there had been 4 predator damage reports in the county over the preceding 6 months, all in the general area of the North County, all attributed to coyotes by the investigating deputy. She could not give me the names of the reporting ranchers. I thanked her and hung up. 4 reports in the North County over 6 months attributed to coyotes. The North County is where Terrell's land is, where my land is, where Earl's land is. I wrote this down. 4 official reports attributed to coyotes from the part of the county where I had 41 documented deaths with wounds that no coyote had ever left on my land or on any other land I had walked over 35 years of ranching. That is the gap I kept running into, between what I had in my binder and what any institution was prepared to receive. The TAHC forms returned blank. The sheriff's report said coyotes. The extension assessment said elevated sulfur and no framework. The veterinary report said cause undetermined. Every institution had a category, and the category was not wide enough for what we had, and so what we had got compressed into the nearest available category, whether it fit or not. I want to ask you something before I go further, because I think this is the kind of account that connects with people who have experienced pieces of it. Have you ever heard about livestock deaths in DeWitt County or anywhere in the surrounding area that matched what I've described? Not a coyote kill, not a feral hog incident, not a disease loss, but specifically this combination: 2 small round wounds at the throat, complete absence of blood at the scene, a body that felt wrong when you pressed it, and no physical sign of what had been there. If you grew up in South Texas, or if you've ranched anywhere in this part of the state, I'd like to know what you've heard. Put it in the comments. This is the kind of history that only comes together when people who hold pieces of it are willing to say so in a place where other people can find it. By July of 2005, I had a combined record with Earl and Terrell of 41 documented deaths across approximately 14 miles of DeWitt County rangeland. The circuit I'd been mapping on the county road atlas I kept on my desk had made 2 full passes that I could trace, the losses hitting each property in roughly the same sequence each time, the interval between incidents on any single property running anywhere from 5 days to 2 weeks. Something was moving through this part of the county in a pattern, and it was not moving randomly. I want to pause here. What I've told you so far is the documentary part, the records and the phone calls and the forms and the soil sample and the composition book entries, and all of that matters because none of it was made up, and all of it can be traced. But the reason I am telling you this now, after 20 years of keeping it mostly to myself, is what I am going to tell you next. The records exist to support the account. The account is what happened to me on the 4th of August, 2005, on a Wednesday night when I was sitting alone in my truck at the northeast corner of the east pasture with a thermal binoculars and a thermos of coffee and a lantern, and what I found in the soft soil at my corner post at 1:47 in the morning, and what I found in the east pasture when I came back at 7 the next morning. I'm going to tell you that part now. I had been running night watches in the east pasture for 3 weeks by the time the 4th of August arrived. Not every night, 3 or 4 nights a week, parking my truck at the northeast corner with the lights off and the windows down from around 11 at night until 3 or 4 in the morning. I had bought a pair of Armasight thermal binoculars, 10 power, out of a hunting equipment catalog, $960 that I justified to myself as a coyote management purchase, even though the pattern of losses I'd been tracking didn't have a coyote explanation. A thermal binoculars reads heat signatures. Everything warm against a cooler background shows up as a lighter shape. Different animals have different silhouettes and body proportions, and you learn to read them over a few hours of use. I'd been watching deer and coyotes and armadillos and feral hogs with that equipment for 3 weeks, and I knew what South Texas wildlife looked like in thermal. August in DeWitt County at midnight is not cool. The temperature the night of the 4th was still in the lower 90s at 11 when I drove out to the corner. I had the windows down and a box fan from my shop running off the power inverter pointed at me from the passenger seat. The moon was about 1/4, low in the west, giving almost no useful light. The east pasture stretched out ahead of me, the does settled and invisible in the dark pasture grass, the stock tank at the far south end of the pasture showing as a slightly lighter rectangle against the darker tone of the live oak motte beyond it. Night watch 1 through 3 had produced nothing unusual. Deer on the second night, 3 does moving along the north fence line around 1 in the morning. Coyotes working the creek bottom to the south on the 3rd night, the sound of them moving south to north through the drainage, the kind of activity I'd heard every summer I'd been on this property. Normal. What I had not anticipated was how much of a night watch is spent with nothing happening and no guarantee that anything will. You sit in the truck, engine off, listening to the pasture settle into itself, and the ordinary nocturnal life of a South Texas ranch goes on around you. The hoot of a great horned owl working the creek bottom, the high-pitched bark of a gray fox somewhere south of the stock tank, the periodic distant truck sounds from the main highway 3 miles east. The does in the pasture are shapes in the dark, invisible but audible, the sound of them shifting weight and moving a few steps and settling again. Their low conversational sounds, the constant background noise of a herd at rest. You learn to read the quality of that noise as a signal. Does at rest sound a particular way? Does that have caught a coyote scent or have something else moving through the pasture sound different? More movement, more frequency to the vocalizations, a subtle change in the texture of the herd noise that you hear without consciously hearing, the way you hear your own name spoken quietly in a loud room. The 4th night, Earl came out and sat with me from 11 until 2. We talked about grass conditions and the cattle market and his daughter's situation up in Austin and everything except what we were there for, and nothing happened, and he drove back to his place around 2:15. Night 5 and 6, nothing. I fell asleep in the truck on the 6th night, somewhere around 2 in the morning, and woke at 4 with a stiff neck and nothing to show for it. Night 7 was a Friday, and I stayed out until 4:30 and saw 2 raccoons at the tank around midnight and nothing else. Night 8, a Sunday. I sat from 11 until 3 in weather that was building to a system, high clouds moving in from the southwest and the temperature actually dropping a few degrees toward morning, which in early August in South Texas registers as significant. Nothing. I was starting to question the schedule. Terrell's composition book showed that his losses had clustered in 5 to 14-day intervals between incidents on the same property. I might be sitting out on a schedule that didn't match the pattern. I had lost 2 does on the night of July the 24th, 11 days before August the 4th. An 11-day interval put the next expected incident sometime in the first week of August. But I had no certainty about any of it, and the pattern might not be a pattern in any predictive sense. I kept going out because stopping felt worse than continuing, and I went out again the following Wednesday. Night 9, August the 4th. I was at the corner from 11. By 1 o'clock I had finished my thermos and was running on the kind of alert weariness that comes from doing the same thing many nights in a row. The moon had set. The thermal glasses were on the seat beside me. I had not seen anything since the deer on night 2. At 1:30, my dogs started. I keep 2 Australian cattle dogs, a male named Burl and a female named Dottie, at the house and the barn. I'd had Burl for 4 years and Dottie for 2, both from a breeder in Yoakum. They were good alert dogs, loud and reliable, and over 4 years I had learned their full vocabulary. The coyote bark, short and sharp, the bark they used for cars on the county road, the sustained territorial sound they made at hogs in the south fence. I knew all of it. What they made at 1:30 in the morning on August the 4th was not any of those. It was continuous, high, a single sustained tone cycling slightly up and down in a repetitive pattern, not territorial, not reactive in the way dogs are reactive to something they want to chase. Something that sounded involuntary, like a sound produced by the body rather than intended by the mind. Both dogs at once, same pattern, and the barn was 600 meters from where I was sitting, and I could hear it clearly across the still night air. It lasted approximately 3 minutes. Then, both dogs stopped, at the same time, in the same moment. The night insect stopped about 10 seconds after that. DeWitt County in August at 1:30 in the morning has a wall of insect sound. Crickets and cicadas and the smaller nocturnal things that live in native grass pasture, a constant background noise so present and unvarying that you stop perceiving it as sound and start perceiving it as texture. When it stopped, what I heard was the specific quality of the absence of it, which has its own character, and what I felt in my chest and hands when I heard it was a physical sensation that I associate now and have always associated with the word dread. Not fear of something I could see, the dread of something that was about to be visible. The smell came next. I had read Terrell's description in his composition book, and I had my own shorter description from 3 separate mornings when I had smelled the trace of it at my carcass sites, the chemical edge that faded by noon. Those descriptions did not prepare me for the full version. What hit my truck cab through the open windows was not an added smell layered over the August pasture. It was a replacement. The night air in a South Texas pasture has a specific compound character. Dry grass, caliche dust, the distant cedar smoke from someone burning brush, the faint green of the stock tank. All of that was gone. What replaced it was chemical and sharp, like a box of matches struck all at once, with something medical underneath it. The specific antiseptic smell of a clean room in a hospital or a laboratory, something that got into the back of the throat and stayed there. I reached for the thermal binoculars. At the northeast corner of the east pasture, at the boundary between the open grass and the brushy cedar and hyzash strip that ran inside the fence line, there was a heat signature. It was upright. I want to describe what I saw in the thermal carefully, and I want to describe it accurately because the accurate description is more important to me than a dramatic one. The signature was on 2 limbs, bipedal. The height relative to the fence line visible in the background I estimated at between 4.5 and 5 feet. The proportions were wrong. This is the word I keep coming back to, and the word I wrote in my notes that night, and the word that is still the most accurate: wrong. Not wrong in a way that suggested a familiar animal in an unfamiliar posture. Wrong in the way that something is wrong when your visual system reaches for the nearest comparison and cannot complete the reach. The head was too large in proportion to the body. The cranium was wide and rounded at the top, tapering to a narrow jaw. The skull was set forward on the neck, rather than seated above it, giving the silhouette a forward-leaning quality at the upper body. The arms were long, longer in proportion to the torso than any large mammal I could put to the image, hanging at the sides with the hands slightly forward, and the hands at the ends of those arms showed as a brighter signature in the thermal than the rest of the body, which can indicate increased blood flow or a different surface temperature at the extremity. The whole shape was standing at the fence line, and it was not moving. I want to add a specific observation about the surface. Animals with fur or feathers show a diffuse outer edge in thermal imaging because the insulating layer holds the body heat and releases it gradually, giving the silhouette a soft or graduated boundary. The shape I was watching had a defined outer edge, sharp, the way metal objects read in thermal, or the way a bare-skinned animal reads, a surface that did not diffuse the heat outward but contained it at the boundary. Along the back, I could make out what appeared to be a series of raised structures running vertically from the mid-back toward the lower back, flat against the body surface rather than erect, spaced with some regularity, though I could not count them precisely at 45 meters. Their thermal signature was slightly different from the surrounding body surface, a marginally higher temperature or a different surface density, visible as a slightly lighter tone in the image. The head, at the top of the silhouette, showed no visible ear structures projecting from the skull. The profile of the cranium from crown to jaw was a continuous arc, smooth. I had been running that equipment for 3 weeks. I had looked at deer and hogs and coyotes and raccoons and every other animal active in this pasture at night. I knew what each of them looked like in thermal, and I had developed a reasonable read on what to look for when identifying a species in the dark. What I was looking at did not match any of those reference images. The proportions, the surface characteristic, the head profile, the arm length, all of it was in a category that the binoculars and my 3 weeks of field use had not prepared me for. I am reporting this as plainly as I can because the plain version is what is accurate and the plain version is strange enough without any addition. I should tell you what I felt during those 20 seconds, because I have spent a lot of time examining it and because it was not what I expected. I expected fear, or something adjacent to fear. The activation response you get when you have been waiting for something and it arrives. What I actually felt was a very specific stillness. A quality of attention that felt imposed from outside rather than chosen from within, as if all of the capacity I normally used for other things had been redirected to a single function. I was not afraid. I was fixed. Every part of me was focused on the fence line in a way that felt less like my decision and more like a condition I was operating within. My breathing was regular. My hands were on the binoculars, and they were not shaking. I could think clearly. I just could not do anything except watch. I held still and counted. 20 seconds. The shape did not move. I thought afterward about what Terrell had said about his hands on the steering wheel, the thought he could form without the action following. I had been able to move my hand to the lantern. I had found the switch by touch. I had lit it. So whatever had operated on Terrell on County Road 118 had either not been present in the same degree or had not applied to me in the same way, or I had been at sufficient distance that the effect was reduced. I do not know which of those things is true. I know that when I lit the lantern I was moving normally, and when I walked to the fence I was walking at my regular pace and my hands at the corner post were steady. I put that in my notes that night because I thought it was important, and I still think so. I reached for the 3,000 lumen LED lantern on the seat beside me. I found the switch by touch. I lit it and directed the beam through the windshield toward the northeast corner, toward the fence line, toward where the shape had been standing. The fence line was empty. Cedar post, 4-strand barbed wire, the brushy strip beyond it, all of it lit up in the bright flat LED wash. I put the binoculars back up. No heat signature at the fence. I panned along the fence in both directions, checked the brushy strip for 20 meters left and right of the corner. Nothing. I got out of the truck. I walked across the 45 meters to the northeast corner of the east pasture with the lantern in my right hand and my eyes on the fence. The summer pasture grass was dry under my boots. The air was still thick with the chemical smell, somewhat reduced but not gone. I reached the corner post and swept the lantern along the fence in both directions. Nothing. I looked into the brushy strip. Nothing. In the soft soil of the cattle trail that ran along the inside of the fence at the corner, I found one footprint, one impression, left side, based on the orientation, roughly the length of my own foot, about 11 or 12 inches, but narrower, the width of the forepart, about half what a human foot of that length would show. The impression had loaded forward, meaning the front of the foot had left the clearest mark and the heel was shallow, consistent with an animal or bipedal form, carrying its weight on the forward part of the foot rather than through a heel-to-toe human gait. The toe area was less defined than the ball of the foot. No claws registered, no human toe separation. A forward-loaded impression from something that stood and walked carrying its weight ahead of its center of gravity. I put my own right hand beside it and took a photograph with my phone. The footprint was longer than my hand by about 2 inches. I walked the surrounding area for 20 minutes with the lantern on its full setting. No additional prints. The caliche and short grass in every direction around the corner showed nothing. No disturbed vegetation in the brushy strip along the fence. No tracks leading to or from the single impression in the cattle trail. I wrote in my phone notes at 1:47 a.m., bipedal thermal signature at northeast corner fence line, 4.5 to 5 feet tall, incorrect proportions, non-human head profile, duration in view approximately 20 seconds, lost subject on activation of directed light, single partial foot impression at corner post, 11 to 12 inches in length, forward loaded, no heel impression, no claws, no further sign. I sat in the truck for another hour. Nothing. The insect sound came back around 2:15, the way it had stopped, all at once, filling the night back in. The chemical smell was gone by 2:30. I drove back to the barn at 3. In the morning, at 7, I went out to check the pastures. I found 2 does dead in the northeast corner of the east pasture, in the same general area where I had been watching from the truck. The same bilateral punctures in the jugular groove. The same complete absence of blood. The same impossible lightness when I pressed my hand against their sides. Both bodies showed elevated internal warmth when I pressed through the collapsed hide. I knelt beside the second one for a long time. She was a young doe, ear tag still intact, number readable in the morning light, and I wrote the number in my phone notes beside the date and time. I had checked her 2 days earlier and found her in good condition. There was nothing in my April inspection records to suggest either of these animals was anything other than healthy. They had been alive at my 6 o'clock evening check the night before. What I kept coming back to was the distance, 45 meters. I had been sitting 45 meters from this corner of the east pasture for 2.5 hours the previous night, with the thermal binoculars and the full attention of someone who had been waiting for this for 3 weeks. I had watched a heat signature stand at my fence line for 20 seconds and then vanish when I lit the lantern. I had walked to the corner post and examined a footprint and spent 20 minutes looking for additional sign. And while all of that was happening, or before it, or after it, 2 does in the northeast corner of the east pasture had been killed in the same way that 18 other animals on this property had been killed since April, with no sound and no evidence of struggle, and nothing left behind but the bodies in the dry ground beneath them. I photographed both animals from 4 angles each, the way I had photographed every carcass since April. I photographed the surrounding ground, the fence line visible in the background, the distance from the corner post to where the bodies lay. I walked the full perimeter of the area looking for any disturbance in the grass or the soil. There was none. No additional footprint, no track, no compressed grass, no disturbance in the brushy strip along the fence. The single partial impression in the cattle trail at the corner post remained the only physical evidence that anything had been in this corner of the pasture in the hours I had been sitting 45 meters away watching it. I had been 45 meters from this corner at 1:30 in the morning. I had sat there for 2.5 hours before going to examine a footprint, 45 meters in the dark while I watched from the truck, or in the time between my approach and my return. Something had been at these does, and they were dead. Whatever the thermal binoculars had shown me at the fence line, whatever had left one partial footprint in the cattle trail dirt, had completed its work at my animals and been gone by the time I drove back to the barn. I called Earl at 7:15. He came over inside the hour and I showed him the carcasses and the footprint photograph on my phone. He stood at the northeast corner for a while without saying anything. Then he said that the same night, sometime between midnight and 2 in the morning, his dogs had done what mine had done. The same sustained tone, not barking, both animals at once, lasting 2 or 3 minutes. He'd gone outside from his house and seen nothing in his pastures. His loss the next morning was one ewe in the pasture adjoining my fence line. Same wounds. He'd noted the smell in his morning field check. Chemical, fading, mostly gone by the time he found the animal. Same night, adjacent properties. My dogs and his dogs within minutes of each other. I called Dr. Marez later that week and she drove out and I showed her the footprint photograph enlarged to 12 by 18 at the FedEx in Cuero. She looked at it for a long time with a desk lamp angled on it. She measured the dimensions from the image against the reference object in the frame, my hand, which she knew the length of from prior hands-on work. She said the mid-foot loading pattern was unlike anything in her experience of native Texas wildlife at that body size. She said she was not in a position to tell me what had made it. She added the photograph to her file. I called Terrell the day after the encounter and described what I had seen in the thermal. He listened, and when I finished, he said he thought it was the same animal he had seen on County Road 118 the previous year, and that he was glad someone else had finally seen it. By the end of August, the losses on my property that season had reached 19. Terrell had 11. Earl had 9. 39 animals across 3 adjacent properties in 6 months, all with the same profile, all within a 14-mile oval I had drawn and redrawn on the County Road Atlas until the pencil lines went through the paper. Then in August of 2007, the television crews arrived in Cuero. I want to be clear about what happened in Cuero, because the 2 stories exist in the same county and the same period, and people have assumed they were the same story. A woman named Phyllis Canyon had been finding dead hairless animals near her property on the edge of Cuero for some time, large-looking canids with thick, crusted skin where fur should have been. She had one of them tested. The DNA analysis came back as domestic canine or coyote, consistent with severe sarcoptic mange, which strips the fur and thickens the skin and changes the appearance of an animal so dramatically that experienced wildlife observers have misidentified mangy coyotes at close range. The finding was reported, and the coverage called it a Chupacabra, and the story spread. I do not dispute what the DNA test showed. It showed what it showed. What I will tell you is what a mangy coyote does not do. A mangy coyote kills with its jaws. The canine dental formula, 6 incisors, 2 canines, 8 premolars, 4 molars per jaw, leaves a wound pattern that any livestock veterinarian in South Texas can read after a year on the job. Torn tissue at the bite site, bruising and compression injury from jaw pressure, individual tooth punctures with the spacing characteristic of the predator species, extensive hemorrhaging at and around the kill site, blood on the animal, blood on the ground, blood on the surrounding vegetation, drag marks and tracks where the predator maneuvered or moved the prey, consumed tissue if the animal fed. A mangy coyote that takes a Rambouillet ewe leaves evidence that is impossible to misread. What Terrell's composition book documented, and what my binder documented, and what Earl's records documented was not any of those things on any of our 41 animals. 2 small round holes with clean edges, no blood at the scene, no tracks, no disturbance in the surrounding ground, a body temperature pattern that should not be present in an animal dead 6 or more hours. A sulfur antiseptic smell that faded by midday and that appeared independently in Terrell's records months before Earl or I had mentioned it to him. A mangy coyote does not produce that. A mangy coyote does not produce the thermal signature I watched stand at my fence line for 20 seconds on a Wednesday night in August of 2005. A mangy coyote does not leave a forward-loaded 11-inch single footprint with no companion tracks. What got attached to DeWitt County in the fall of 2007 was a coyote with mange. That animal, whatever its DNA showed, was found dead and was measured and photographed and tested and explained. It is the explained part of the DeWitt County Chupacabra story. The unexplained part is everything in my binder. The unexplained part is Terrell Hicks sitting at his kitchen table with his green composition book and reading me 7 lines from July 23, 2004. The unexplained part is Earl, standing at the northeast corner of my east pasture with the footprint photograph in his hands, not saying anything, because there was nothing either of us had a word for. I did not talk to any of the television people. Neither did Earl. Neither did Terrell, who told me afterward that he'd watched the coverage in his living room and turned the television off after about 4 minutes. He said the thing that got to him was not the characterization of the animal as a mangy coyote, which was what the DNA said, and he was willing to accept it, said that, but the assumption in the coverage that the word Chupacabra now had an explanation, and that the explanation was complete. He said it reminded him of the way the Army had investigated the incidents he'd witnessed in Vietnam and come back with conclusions that satisfied the investigators without having much to do with what he had seen on the ground. He said that was a different experience, and he wasn't comparing them. He was describing the quality of the feeling, which was the feeling of a gap between what you knew from direct contact with a situation and what the official account said happened. There were a handful of ranchers in the county who knew what I'm describing and who were quietly relieved when the Mangy Coyote story took hold, because it gave their neighbors and the county extension office and the TAHC a place to put the losses. You can show a Mangy Coyote carcass on television, and people accept that as a cause for dead livestock. You cannot show a partial footprint in a cattle trail with no companion tracks and have people accept it the same way. The Mangy Coyote gave everyone a door to close, and most people in the county closed it, and I understood why they did, because keeping it open had costs. I did not close it. I kept my binder current. I kept the footprint photograph in a folder at the front of the binder where I could find it. I kept Terrell's composition book pages in the binder alongside my own records. I drove past the northeast corner of the east pasture every morning on my rounds, and I checked the fence and I checked the air. I did not talk to any of the television people. Neither did Earl. Neither did Terrell, who told me afterward that he'd watched the coverage in his living room and turned the television off after about 4 minutes. The losses in DeWitt County did not stop after the 2007 coverage. My binder has 3 entries for 2008, all from the same northeast corner of the east pasture where I'd been documenting losses since the spring of 2005. 2 entries in 2009, 1 in 2010, a yearling heifer found in the south pasture in early April, the same wounds, the same absence of blood at the scene, the same elevated warmth in the chest cavity when I found her at 7 in the morning. I photographed her and wrote the entry and put it in the binder. Terrell's last composition book entry was in 2011, a steer in his creek bottom that he called me about. We drove out together and looked at it, and Terrell measured the wounds with the small folding ruler he'd been using since 2005 and noted the dimensions in his book. The smell was present, faint, already fading in the morning sun. He looked at me over the carcass and said, "Still here." I said, "Yeah." Earl told me in 2013 that he hadn't had a documented loss since 2009, but that he'd smelled what he called the smell once, in his south pasture at dawn the previous fall, with no dead animals and nothing visibly wrong anywhere on the property. He'd stood out there in the early October morning and smelled it, and then it was gone. He'd checked all his stock. All of them were fine. I asked him what he thought that meant. He said he thought it meant whatever it was still working this part of the county, just taking less than before. The last entry in my binder is dated October the 8th, 2016. 2 boar does in the northeast corner of the east pasture, same location as my first losses in April of 2005. 11 years between April 2005 and October 2016, and the northeast corner of the east pasture produced an entry in both of those years. The wounds were the same. The blood absence was the same. The body weight was wrong in the same specific way it had been wrong on doe number 47 on a Monday morning in April, more than a decade before. Earl is still on his property to the west, still running ewes on the south pasture where he had his documented losses in 2005. We talk most weeks on the phone or across a fence line about the same things ranching families in this county have always talked about: grass conditions, cattle prices, water, The cost of everything going up and the price of what you sell staying flat. We don't talk about the binder much anymore, but there is an understanding between us that sits underneath every other conversation, put there by those years of comparing records across the fence, and it does not require maintenance. He knows what I know. He was there for enough of it. That is sufficient. Terrell's composition book, the relevant pages of it, is still in my binder. Terrell passed away in 2019. Heart attack, in the barn, same way his father went out before him. He had told me years earlier that he wanted what was in that composition book to be part of whatever account I eventually made, because he thought it was documentation that deserved to exist somewhere outside a drawer in a filing cabinet. I am honoring that. The 7-line entry for County Road 1, 18 July 23rd, 2004, is in my binder alongside the entries from 2005, and it will stay there. I keep my binder in the filing cabinet in my office, alongside 35 years of production records. It has 41 entries. It has photographs, field measurements, copies of TAHSC forms and veterinary reports, and Faye Delton's Extension Service assessment and the lab report from College Station about the sulfur concentrations in the soil. It has a photocopy of the relevant pages from Terrell's green composition book and the photographs I took of his entries. It has Dr. Marez's wound documentation from multiple site visits and the Victoria Lab tissue report from 2005. It has the photograph of the single footprint at my corner post, 12 by 18 inches, and the date and the time and my field notes from that night. What the binder does not have is an explanation. I spent years looking for one. I read the accounts from Puerto Rico from the 1990s, the similar wound profiles, and the same absence of blood, and the same pattern of official explanations that didn't match what witnesses had documented. I read the accounts from Calama, Chile, from South Texas ranchers in Webb County and Valverde County and Kinney County, who had logged the same pattern across different decades. I talked to ranchers in Gonzales County and Lavaca County, who had their own quiet losses they'd written off the same way. The wound profile holds. The exsanguination holds. The absence of evidence holds. The sulfur smell holds. The dog behavior holds. I do not know what the Chupacabra is. I do not know what I watched cross into the cedar break on County Road 118 that Terrell Hicks described in 7 lines in his composition book in 2004. I do not know what stood at my fence line in the thermal at 1:30 in the morning on August the 4th, 2005, and I do not know how it left one partial footprint and then no others. I do not know why the cattle dogs on my property and Earl's property fell silent at the same time on the same night and would not make a normal sound again until morning. What I know is what I have written down and what I have kept, 41 entries across 11 years, each one dated, located by GPS coordinate, described in the same order: animal, wound profile, body temperature reading, ground conditions, ambient conditions, any other observations. Every entry in my handwriting because I wrote every one of them myself, the same evening or the next morning, while the details were still immediate. I did not reconstruct any of them later. The discipline of writing it down while it was fresh was the one thing I committed to in April of 2005 and did not break. 41 animals with the same wound profile, the same blood absence, the same temperature anomaly, the same inexplicable lightness when I put my hand on them. One thermal sighting, one partial footprint, one smell that I can still describe exactly, still identify if I encountered it again, that replaced the South Texas night air in my truck cab like nothing else I had ever breathed. And I know that the Mangy Coyote story about DeWitt County is a story about an animal that died near someone's property and was tested and explained. That is a different story. That is the story people tell now when the county comes up. This is the other story, the one that does not have an explanation, the one that 41 entries in a binder in my filing cabinet say happened here. My grandfather stood on this ground 100 years ago and built something on it and passed it down. I intend to pass it down too. I go out to the northeast corner of the east pasture every morning as part of my rounds, the same 6 o'clock rotation my father ran and his father before him. I check the fence and the stock and the water. I check the air when I step out of the truck, a half second of attention to whether the morning smells the way a South Texas morning should. Most mornings it does. Most mornings I get caliche dust and dry grass and the faint highway in the distance, and I go about the day's work and don't think about my binder until the end of the month when I add the latest production numbers. But I always check. That habit started on an April morning in 2005, and I have not broken it since, and I will not break it as long as I am on this land. Because whatever is in that binder came from somewhere and goes somewhere and has been to this county more than once, and the mangy coyote in the freezer in Cuero never did account for any part of it.